Hello, hello. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in right here to Jay Slay, Made in the USA, where we explore truth, expose deception, and inspire courage. Guys, first of all, I'm going to ask for something that I rarely even remember to say in any of my videos, which is kind of stupid. If you don't mind, if you're here and watching, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. That way you'll be notified when my videos come out. I don't put out as many these days as I'm spending quite a bit of time on rooftops trying to make some money. But there will come a time, probably early in the new year, where I get back on a regular cycle of releasing interviews, releasing videos, and also content that I've created straight from scratch. So I'm talking to a couple producers right now. So that being said, you're going to like and you're subscribed to my Rumble. Second, I'd like to call your attention to an article that I just completed, which is related to the content you're here for. It's about the life and times, but specifically the man, Cyrus Ingerson Schofield. I know many of you that are on Rumble or follow me, you may have an idea of who that is, or you may know who that is very well. But he was probably the key person through his Schofield Reference Bible that introduced the masses through the Bible colleges of the time. We're talking early 1900s to premillennial dispensationalism with a heavy emphasis on the rapture and Zionism. And I did a lot of research on this. To put this article together was well over 100 hours of research. That's no joke. And I can't say that it's definitely the first time that I've really looked a lot, that all of the pieces of his life, there was the really weird stuff that you can only find in the archives of the Plymouth Brethren. I've pulled all of what I think is relevant together to paint a picture of who this man was. Should we trust him? So you can check that out at the link in the description, as well as you can just go to jslayusa.com. Now that goes straight to my Substack page. So you'll get the free version, which is about the first third of the important parts of his life. And then if you pay the subscription, you can get the rest. So read that first third. If it's something that you think you'd be into and you want to know more about, support me, hook me up with a paid subscription, and you'll get the rest of it. It's fairly long, but to untangle a knot like what has been created, at least what I think is a deception, it takes quite a bit of untying. So that being said, premillennial dispensationalism is one of the four eschatologies, or the ways to view the book of Revelation and Daniel and the other prophetic books in the Bible. And it's been a topic of big interest to me. And I was sent Steve Gregg. He's a Bible scholar, Bible teacher, and an author. And in the video you're about to watch, this is him giving a dissertation. It's very easy to understand. You may not be familiar with some dates or times or people, but he does a great job of explaining it. And what I love about Steve Gregg is, even when it's a controversial topic, he has the ability to really not seem to have a dog in the fight. I mean, he definitely holds to one of these views, one of these four, but it's kind of tough to tell which one it is. And very humble, and just really wants to teach the audience how to think through these issues using facts and using what we know that's in Scripture, and also what the early church fathers had to say, and on down the line. So you've been with me now for almost 5 minutes. I'll stop talking and we'll get to the video with Steve Gregg on the four views of Revelation.
Tonight we are going to be going through the four views of the book of Revelation. I taught this lecture, I think it was a couple of months ago, in Yorba Linda. As you know, probably, I wrote a book on the subject back in 1997. This is the book that came out. It was only about 550 pages. They wanted me to revise and update it, so I did last year. It's now 600 pages. Paperback, cheaper. And you can't buy it from me, because you can't buy anything from me. I won't sell anything, but you can buy them elsewhere. The book is called Revelation, Four Views, a Parallel Commentary, and it basically introduces the reader to four different standard approaches to the book of Revelation. And I say standard approaches. All of these approaches, though very different from each other, have been held by evangelical leaders for centuries. It's very difficult to know what the very earliest view of Revelation was that the early church had, for the simple reason that Revelation wasn't actually added to the canon of Scripture until the year 397 AD. Now, it was around before that. It was written in the first century, but its authorship was disputed. Its canonicity, that is, whether it belongs in the Bible or not, was disputed in the church until almost 300 years after it was written. And that's because they weren't sure if John the Apostle had written it or some other John had written it. Some churches accepted it from the very earliest times as belonging to Scripture. Other churches held it at some arm's length. The church in Alexandria was very slow to accept it, and there were other churches that weren't quite sure. But it was finally added to the canon of Scripture in 397 at the Council of Carthage. But because it was not in the canon of Scripture until almost 400 AD, we don't have an awful lot of commentary on the book of Revelation from those early centuries. The early church fathers didn't comment on it very much, partly because they didn't even know if it was in the Bible or not. But they knew of it, and they sometimes quoted from it, just not enough for us to really identify what their view of the whole book was. But from the later centuries of the early church, different views of Revelation began to emerge and have still held sway. There still are 4 entirely different approaches to the book of Revelation that are held by evangelical, conservative, Bible-believing Christians. Now, I would have never believed that. Growing up, I was only familiar with one view of Revelation. And when I began to be a Bible teacher, I still had only heard one view of Revelation, and that was in 1970. I taught that one view, and only that one view, because I didn't know there were any others around. And I taught it for many years. And then I began to be exposed to commentaries by other evangelicals outside of my denominational stream. And to my shock, there were people who held entirely different approaches to the book of Revelation. Now, when I say entirely different, I'm emphasizing entirely because many people know of some slight differences. For example, when you hear 4 views of Revelation, I think, well, we've got the pre-trib, and we've got the mid-trib, and we've got the post-trib. Like, there's 3 of them right there, right? No, those aren't 3 of them. That's one of them. That's 3 varieties of one of them. And, some people said, well, then you must mean the amillennial, the premillennial, and the postmillennial views. No, that's only 3 also, and those are not the views of Revelation. Those are views of the millennium, and therefore they are views of one chapter in Revelation, the only chapter that mentions the millennium, frankly, the only chapter in the whole Bible that mentions the millennium. That's Revelation 20. But the rest of the book, the other 21 chapters, are seen in different ways by different Bible students. And they're much more different than you might think if you're not already familiar with them. What are the 4 views? Well, we'll get into that. I'm going to tell you tonight what each of the 4 views believes, and that'll certainly take up our whole evening. But before we get into a survey of the 4 views, I want to talk about some preliminary issues that you can't really make any sense of some of these views unless you have dealt with these issues, all right? And I've given you notes. If you don't have notes, there should be one on your seat where you're sitting. And I want to acquaint you with some things that many people don't tell you about the book of Revelation. One is that the book of Revelation is unique in that it occupies 3 different genres of literature. There's no other book in the world, as far as we know, that occupies all 3 of these genres. First of all, the book is an epistle. Like most of the books of the New Testament, it's written from an author to a church or churches. Just like Paul wrote to the church in Rome and the church in Corinth and the church at Thessalonica and the church in Ephesus, and James wrote to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad and so forth, and Peter wrote to those who were in Asia and Bithynia and Galatia and so forth. All the epistles of the Bible are written by somebody to either a church, usually a church or churches, or an individual, as in the case of Paul writing to Timothy or to Philemon or to Titus. But they are personal letters. And now they are more than just personal letters, but you can see that Paul's letters are very personal. He greets his friends there. He talks about where he's been traveling, what he's been going through, what his emotions have been. And he also gets into theological stuff. They are authoritative letters from apostles, and therefore they have remained in our canon of Scripture. But nonetheless, we have to understand that they are epistles. Now, I said that Revelation is also an epistle, and I can easily justify that. If you look at Revelation chapter 1 and verse 4, It says, John, to the 7 churches which are in Asia. Now, obviously, that's the form of an epistle. Paul begins by saying, Paul, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to the churches of Galatia, or to the church of Colossae, or to whoever he's writing to. This is the way an ordinary letter would open in those days. And the author identifies himself as John, and we take that to be John the Apostle, who may have been the last surviving of the 12 apostles at the time this was written. And it says, to the 7 churches which are in Asia. Now, Asia does not mean what we mean by Asia. When we talk about Asia, we're talking about a huge continent that includes China and India and, Thailand and, Vietnam and Korea and Japan, all those countries. Asia in the Bible times, we're talking about during the Roman times. There was a province of the Roman Empire that was called Asia, or Asia Minor. And that is the same geographical landmass that is now called Turkey. They didn't call it Turkey until the Turkomans came and dominated the area. But in the days of the Roman Empire, that region was called Asia, or Asia Minor. That's where these 7 churches are. Later in the epistle, it identifies them by name in verse 11, where Jesus says to John, what you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Now, these churches are essentially not there anymore, but they were there when John wrote the book. In many cases, the cities aren't even there anymore, to say nothing of the churches. There is a fellowship of sorts at Philadelphia still, and there is a city of sorts, a church of sorts, in Smyrna, which is now called Izmir in Turkey. But apart from those 2, the other 5 churches are gone, and in many cases the cities are gone. Even Ephesus, a very important church in Paul's day, and John's day too, even the city of Ephesus doesn't exist anymore, much less the church there. So we're talking about historical ancient churches that mostly aren't there anymore, but were there when he wrote this. This is an epistle to those churches from the Apostle John, or more properly from Jesus, because Jesus is dictating the contents for John to write. Now look at the end of the book of Revelation, chapter 22 and verse 21. It says, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen. Now, if you would take the time, not now but later, to look at the end of each of Paul's epistles, he always ends by saying, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be unto you. That's how he closes an epistle, just like we'd say, sincerely, or whatever. We would have some other kind of way of ending letters in our culture. But this is the way epistles were written. The book starts like an epistle, it ends like an epistle. It is an epistle to 7 churches that were in Asia at the time. So the book is an epistle. In that respect, it's not at all unique among biblical books, because almost all the books of the New Testament are epistles. There's only really probably 2 exceptions. The Gospel of, maybe 3. The Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of John were not epistles. But Luke and Acts were written by Luke to a man named Theophilus, and the rest of the books in the New Testament were all epistles from Paul or someone else. So is the book of Revelation. But I said Revelation's unique, not in being an epistle, but by occupying 3 different genres of literature. An epistle is one. It is also a prophecy. We see that from the statement in chapter 1, verse 3, where it says, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy. So he says this book is a prophecy. Now, you'd say, duh, what else would you think of Revelation? Of course it's a prophecy. Well, it is a prophecy, but you may not realize how unusual it is that an epistle would be a prophecy. No other epistle in the Bible is a prophecy. This is the only epistle in the Bible that's dictated by Jesus Christ. This is an epistle from Christ to the 7 churches, dictated through his servant John. All the other epistles are from Paul or James or John or Peter, a servant of Jesus Christ. This is an epistle from Jesus Christ, and as such it is a verbal oracle from God, like Isaiah might have written, or Jeremiah, or one of the prophets of old. It's the only book of prophecy in the New Testament. There are other prophecies, of course, in the New Testament. In the Gospels, we have Jesus making some prophetic statements. Paul makes a few in his writings. In fact, a number of the New Testament writers will include a prophetic word or two in their epistles, but this is the only book of the New Testament that is itself a prophecy, like an Old Testament book. Now, the Old Testament doesn't have any epistles. The New Testament doesn't have any prophecies, except for this book. And so this book holds both offices. It's a book of prophecy, like Daniel is, or Isaiah is. It's also a book like Paul's epistles written to churches. Now, I want to make this clear that when we talk about an epistle, we're talking about a message that was given to a certain set of original readers. It may have application to others besides the original readers, but its primary application is to the original readers. For example, when we read to the letters of Paul to the Thessalonians or to the Corinthians, we recognize immediately there are things going on in those churches that Paul is addressing. There are people in a specific time and place that he has in mind. He's addressing situations that they are in, and we will not understand those epistles without understanding something about the situation they were in and what it was he was concerned to communicate to them, the original readers. Now, we also know, of course, that Corinthians and Thessalonians and the other epistles have statements that are broad and universal, so that even though they were not written to us, they are nonetheless written for our benefit too. That the epistles of the Bible are written to an original audience, and their initial meaning must be understood in terms of who that initial audience is. But the principles in it are much more broadly applicable to Christians anywhere. And so is the book of Revelation. When we look for the meaning of the book of Revelation, we have to realize this is an epistle. It's written to actual people. It addresses situations that they really are in. And therefore, whatever interpretation we give it, it has to have some kind of relevance to the original audience. It may have additional relevance to others besides, but that's a secondary level, just like any epistle. Now, when we talk about prophecy, that's the second category. What's a prophecy? Well, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14, I think it's verse 3, he said, "He that prophesies speaks to the exhortation, edification, and comfort of men." So, prophecy edifies, it exhorts, and it comforts. And the book of Revelation obviously has all those features. There are two elements in prophecy that have often been pointed out by Bible teachers. One is that prophecy sometimes tells the future, of course. In fact, some people think of it primarily in that function. They think of it almost entirely as telling the future, but that's not really the case. If you read the book of Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, you'll find that most of the time they're not really predicting anything, they're preaching. The prophets preached repentance, they preached against sin, they preached against the abominations people were doing, and they preached judgment, and then they made predictions, specific predictions. But actually, as you read through the Old Testament prophets, the vast majority of what they wrote wasn't really predicting anything, but denouncing. Denouncing sin, denouncing the behavior of the apostates, and so forth. Anyone who's read the prophets knows this is true. And so in addition to predicting things, the prophets would speak forth God's oracle against or for the people they're addressing. Generally speaking, prophets came when people were misbehaving. And so usually in their sermons, they're denouncing the people, and they peppered their sermons with predictions about things that are going to happen. So you've got the foretelling of the Word of God, which is the sermonic aspects of prophecy. And then there's the foretelling, F-O-R-E, telling, predicting, foretelling things in advance. So prophets would foretell a message, current and applicable to the readers, and would foretell future events. Revelation, being a prophecy, has both of those features. The first three chapters, especially the 7 letters to the 7 churches, clearly address the situations in the churches as they were at the time. Jesus says to each one of them, after he greets them and tells who he is, he says, "I know your works." Every time he says, "I know your works." And then he begins to comment about their works. Usually he has something negative to say, but before he says it, he usually says something positive. Generally speaking, he'll say something positive if he can about the church, and then he'll say, "But I have something against you," and he'll say something negative. Now, this is the pattern in general, but there's actually some exceptions. 2 of the churches, the Church of Smyrna and the Church of Philadelphia, are the only churches he has nothing negative to say to. He only says good and encouraging things to them, those 2 churches. Interestingly enough, they're the only 2 of those 7 churches still around. He didn't call them to repent because he didn't identify anything for them to repent of. And so they stand out as exceptions to the general rule that he speaks only well to them and not negatively. But then there's two other churches, Sardis and Laodicea, that he says nothing good about. He only has bad things to say. After he says, I know your works, he starts reading off the laundry list of things they're doing wrong. And there's no good things about those two churches that he has to say. And so the general pattern is to say, I know your works, these are the good things I know you're doing, but I have something against you, and this is what I have against you. That is Jesus' words. These are the only epistles in the Bible that are dictated by Jesus himself. They're prophetically dictated to John. And they are forthtelling. They're not foretelling future things. They're forthtelling the word of the Lord to those churches about their state. And the ones that he has something negative to say, he calls them to repent and makes promises to those who will be overcomers. Okay, so that's what the first three chapters are about. Then at chapter 4, you begin to see John's caught up into the heavens. He sees the throne of God. He sees the strange throne attendants, the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures and gazillions of angels. And he describes all this and the praise that emanates from them. And that occupies chapters 4 and 5. But then in chapter 5, he sees a scroll with 7 seals upon it. And initially, it appears as if it will never be opened, because a great voice in the early part of chapter 5 cries out and says, throughout heaven and earth says, who's worthy to break the 7 seals and open the scroll? And the question was not who's strong enough to. Anyone's strong enough to break wax seals. Seals were not hard to break, they're wax. The question was who is authorized? Who's worthy to do it is the question. Anyone could do it if they're authorized, but no one's authorized. And initially no one was found in heaven or earth or under the earth who was authorized to do it. And John began to weep, and one of the elders said to him, oh, don't weep, John. The Lion of the tribe of Judah has prevailed, has triumphed to break the seals and open the scroll. And so John looked up to see this Lion of the tribe of Judah, and what he saw was a lamb as if it had been slain, with 7 eyes and 7 horns. And we know this is a symbol for Christ. And the Lamb went up and received the scroll from the hand of him who sat on the throne, and then all of heaven burst forth into a huge celebration of praise. It begins with the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures singing, and then angels join them, 10,000s and 10,000s of angels, and then every creature in heaven and earth and in the sea and under the sea they're all joined in by the end of chapter 5. Everything, there's not a voice that isn't praising God, because the Lamb has taken this scroll and is about to open the seals. And from that point on, the future, from John's point of view, begins. That's where the predictions begin. That's where the foretelling begins. Because each seal is opened, and as each seal is opened, something happens. And after the 7th seal is opened, there's 7 angels with 7 trumpets that appear. And they each sound their trumpet in sequence, and each time they sound a trumpet, something happens, and so forth through the rest of the book. There are things happening which are predictions from John's point of view, predicting what is going to happen in the future. So the book is an epistle which has a message to the original audience, but secondarily to everybody else. It is a prophecy in that it foretells and it forthtells the Word of God. We're mostly familiar with the foretelling part, the predictive part. That's the part that we want to get to real quick when we start reading the book. Oh, forget about this 7 letters to 7 churches. I want to see what's going to happen in the end times. Well, that's just the point. Only one of the 4 views believes it is even about the end times. Can you imagine 3 views that don't? Well, there are 3 entirely different views that don't even believe Revelation is about the end times. So we're going to look at all 4 of those views, but let me just say that there's a third category the book falls into. In addition to being an epistle and a prophecy, it's also an apocalypse. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that term. The name of the book of Revelation in the Greek New Testament is apocalypsis. And the anglicized form of the word apocalypsis is apocalypse. If you were raised a Catholic and read a Catholic Bible, you know that the book is actually called the Apocalypse in the Catholic Bible. And that's just because they transliterate the Greek name, but the Protestant Bibles translate the name, and apocalypse comes from 2 Greek words, apa, which means away from, and kalypsis, which means cover. or veil. Now, apa means to away from, and kalypsis means veil, unveil, remove the veil away is what really apocalypsis means. So the word apocalypse or revelation means an unveiling, a removing of the curtain to let you see what's going on behind the scenes. Okay? That's what the book is called. Now, because it is called the apocalypse, we have a whole genre of literature called apocalyptic literature. Now, this literature was written between the year 200 BC and 100 AD. Many, many books were produced by the Jews and Christians during those 300 years. The book of Revelation was also written near the end of that 300-year period. But before the book of Revelation was written, there were a bunch of other books. The Sibylline Oracles, the book of Enoch, the Testimony of the 12 Patriarchs, and a lot of others. The Jews had a lot of books they wrote in what we call the intertestamental period. Between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's 400 years there. And in the latter part of that period, the Jews wrote a bunch of books, and they were all very much like the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, when it came to be written, was later in that period, and obviously any reader of the book would have recognized it's a book of the same sort as these other apocalyptic books. Now, they weren't called apocalyptic. Modern scholars call them apocalyptic in retrospect because the book of Revelation is the apocalypse, and they recognize that it's the same style. The Jews didn't have a name for this style of literature. But it was a very symbolic, very poetic, very sensationalistic type of literature. It described the struggles of the Jews in most cases, although the Christian apocalypses describe the struggles of the Christians, usually in times of great persecution. That's one thing the apocalyptic literature all had in common. They also had in common that the writer always claimed that some angel was guiding him around, showing him visions, explaining them to him, and so forth. I'm talking about the ones other than the book of Revelation. I'm talking about all those apocalyptic literature that was written before Revelation was written. And they were filled with dragons and monsters and angels and earthquakes and planets blowing up and stars falling and things like that. This is the kind of stuff that apocalyptic literature was. That's the imagery they used. But scholars know who've studied apocalyptic literature that this was an entirely symbolic way of looking at things, because what they were really describing was struggles between the Jews and their persecutors. Very earthly things described in cosmic imagery. Now, we might say, why'd they do that? I don't know. But they did. And we know that they were doing this with a lot of their literature before the book of Revelation was even written. And therefore, we can see, once we study these apocalypses, that God gave John this book in a style that was already very popular among the Jews and the Christians of the time, which they would be more familiar with than we are. It's not the case that any modern Western writers write apocalyptic literature, though we have our own genres. We have science fiction, for example. We have, cowboy and Indian stories and things like that, the Louis L'Amour stories and things like that. There's different genres of literature that are popular with different crowds. Well, one genre that was popular with Jews and Christians in general was this apocalyptic style. And Jesus apparently chose that style, because it was popular, to convey his message through John to these other people. There's no other way to conclude, because we know that Revelation is very much like these other apocalypses. Now, we are very fortunate to have a very striking example of apocalyptic literature that's of the non-inspired. When I'm talking about these other apocalypses, we're not talking about inspired literature. We're just talking about religious literature that the Jews wrote. But just like C.S. Lewis wrote this, the Space Trilogy or the Chronicles of Narnia or something like that. I mean, there's a good example. C.S. Lewis wrote the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. Well, they're not true stories. They're fantasies. They're mythology. They're children's stories. But he couched a Christian message in them. That was his choice of an avenue to convey his Christian message through a literary device of children's literature with mythology and things like that as the milieu. And so also, apparently, Christ chose apocalyptic style to convey the message of the book of Revelation. Now, I said we're very fortunate to have a good example of this in an apocalyptic passage that has survived and is even found in the Catholic Bible, because it is found in the Septuagint, and the Catholic Bible includes this in their Bible. You know, the Catholic Bible has some books in it that aren't in the Protestant Bible, what we call the Apocrypha. And among the apocryphal writings was an apocryphal paragraph that was a prologue to the book of Esther. And there's also another paragraph that's an epilogue to the book. Now, you know the book of Esther. It's a really, mundane kind of story about, a love relationship between a queen and her king, and this crisis that arose for the Jews, and how her uncle Mordecai discovered the plot and revealed the plot, and the bad guy got hung, and the good guys prevailed, and all this. It's a story. In fact, it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. All the books of the Bible mention God except the book of Esther. It's just that down to earth. It's obvious you can see God's hand through the whole book, but it doesn't ever mention God by name in the book. But the story is known to us, and you don't really find anything very supernatural in the book of Esther, although many providential things. In fact, the providence of God is probably more visible in the book of Esther than almost any other short story in the Bible. But what I wanted to say is that the book of Esther is inspired. It is biblical. It is canonical. But the epilogue and the prologue that some apocryphal writer wrote for Esther is not inspired. It was written centuries later by a writer who claimed to be Mordecai. Now, Mordecai is one of the main characters in the story of Esther. The writer of this epilogue and prologue was not Mordecai. But see, almost all the apocalyptic literature is written by people claiming to be someone else. The non-inspired apocalypses of the Jews claimed they were written by Enoch, or written by Baruch, or written by the 12 patriarchs, or something like that, but they weren't. It's just one of their literary devices of apocalyptic literature. Now, this writer, we don't know who it was, but he claimed to be Mordecai, and he wrote a paragraph that he put before the book of Esther and a paragraph he put after. And these are written in the standard apocalyptic style of the literature of that period, and they're a great example for us of this kind of stuff, because he claims that he had a dream. I've got it in your notes so you can read along if you want. Here's what Mordecai's dream is. This paragraph is affixed in the apocryphal Bible before the book of Esther proper. And Mordecai, the alleged speaker, says, "Behold, noise and confusion, thunders and earthquake, tumult upon the earth. And behold, two great dragons came forward, both ready to fight. They roared terribly, and at their roaring every nation prepared for war to fight against the nation of the righteous. And behold, a day of darkness and gloom, tribulation and distress, affliction and great tumult upon the earth. And the whole righteous nation was troubled. They feared the evils that threatened them, and were ready to perish. Then they cried to God, and from their cry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river with abundant water. Light came, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted and consumed those who held in honor." Now, can you make any sense of that story? That's Mordecai's alleged dream. Then in the Apocryphal Bible follows the actual book of Esther, the same as we have it in our Bible. But at the end there's another apocryphal paragraph. It's the epilogue, and I've got it here for you. At the end of the book of Esther, the same hand writes this: "I remember the dream that I had concerning these matters, and none of them has failed to be fulfilled. The tiny stream, which became a river, and there was light and sun and abundant water. The river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen. The two dragons are Haman and myself. The nations are those gathered to destroy the name of the Jews, and my nation, this is Israel, who cried out to God and were saved." Now, you can see how non-literal this dream represented the story in. You've got dragons, you've got earthquakes, you've got famines, you've got every nation in the world at war. The whole earth is shaken, there's tribulation, there's distress. And yet, it's just an apocalyptic paragraph describing the book of Esther, where none of those kinds of things really happened. And at the end he says, yeah, the dragons, that was me and Haman, and the nations were against, that's the Persians coming against the Jews, and the river was Esther, and the light and the dawning was the great deliverance. In other words, we have in this wonderful sample of apocalyptic literature a test case to see how the Jews were expected to understand this kind of apocalyptic imagery. The story itself was very non-sensational, but the apocalyptic description of it was very sensational. In fact, that sensational dream sounded like it could have been taken right out of the book of Revelation, or frankly out of the book of Enoch, or out of the book of Baruch, or out of any number of the apocalyptic books. But you can see easily that those who were reading this kind of literature and received as an epistle the book of Revelation to their churches, they were accustomed to this kind of flamboyance of expression. I mentioned a moment ago that when John saw the Lamb, when he was first of all said to be the Lion of the tribe of Judah, then he looked and he was a lamb, and he had 7 eyes and 7 horns. Does Jesus really look like that? Does anyone really think Jesus looks like a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns? No, of course not. No one believes that, nor should we. Even later in the book of Revelation, he's a man on a horse. He's not a lamb. You see, these are symbols. This is how apocalyptic literature communicated. Now, once we become familiar with that, we're in a much better position to decide some of the decisions we have to make about understanding the meaning of the book of Revelation. And we'll have some more clues given later on. This is just for starter. So I want you to be aware of what kind of book we're talking about. We're talking about a book that is at once an epistle, a prophecy, and an apocalypse. And by the way, it's the only apocalypse in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there's a few. Daniel, Zechariah, and a few of the prophets have definitely apocalyptic passages in them. But those ones are inspired. I think it's probably books like Daniel and Zechariah that inspired the intertestamental Jews to write books that were imitations of those. So the uninspired apocalypses probably copied the inspired apocalypses of Daniel and Zechariah and those kinds of books. But the book of Revelation is inspired. At least we accept it as such. It's in the canon of Scripture. So I believe that Daniel and Zechariah and Revelation are inspired apocalypses. But they follow a type of literature of which there are many uninspired examples written by the Jews around the period of time that Revelation was popular and was written. Okay, now, a second important set of considerations before we get into the 4 separate views is the date of writing and the setting that the readers were in. Now, with some books of the Bible, these issues aren't as important as with others. If you want to understand the book of 1 Corinthians, you've got to know something about what was going on in the church at Corinth. If you want to understand the book of Romans, it's not going to matter quite as much what's going on in the church in Rome, because frankly, it's more of a generic epistle. It's more of a generic theological treatise. But some of the epistles, you really got to know what's going on there to know why in the world Paul says such and such a thing to him. In the book of Revelation, we need to have some idea of when it was written, and in particular, we need to know who the emperor was at the time. And there are 2 theories about this. First of all, everyone agrees Revelation was written at a time of great persecution. There's many references to it. In Revelation 2:9 and in Revelation 3:9, there's evidence that the Jewish community in Smyrna and in Philadelphia were persecuting the Christians in that town. Not surprising. They persecuted Paul wherever he went, and they persecuted the church in Jerusalem. And so it would appear some of the churches were experiencing local persecution. There was one church that already had a martyr. Probably not martyred by the Jews, because it was not one of the churches that had Jewish problems, but Roman problems. Probably the Romans had killed this one martyr. His name was Antipas. We know nothing about him except he's named in one of the epistles as a martyr. The church of Smyrna is told that they're going to have tribulation for 10 days and that the devil is going to throw some of them into jail. But they should endure to the end, and they receive a crown of life. As you go through the book of Revelation, you can see there's a lot of persecution motif. And not only persecution, but also martyrs in heaven. John sees the souls of martyrs in heaven when the 5th seal is broken in chapter 6. He sees the martyrs in heaven again in chapter 20. There's a lot of references to martyrs in the book of Revelation. There's those who overcame Satan by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and who did not love their lives even to the death, in Revelation 12:11. So we can see that through the book there's this martyrdom persecution theme. And I don't think there's a scholar or a commentary on Revelation, regardless of their viewpoint of the book, who would deny that this was written to comfort Christians in a time of suffering and persecution. But the question is, which time? There were two emperors in the first century, in John's lifetime, who persecuted the church very severely. One of them was Nero, and one was a much later emperor named Domitian. Now, most modern commentators will tell you that this was written during the reign of Domitian. If you have a study Bible, and it has like notes at the beginning of each book, it'll probably say when you come to Revelation, it's written late in the reign of Domitian, probably around the year 96. This is sort of the standard popular view today. In earlier centuries, it was commonly thought that it was written during the reign of Nero. Now, Nero was much earlier than Domitian, and it may seem like it doesn't matter to you whether it was written in the reign of Nero or the reign of Domitian, but when we come to consider the four views, this will be a very important point. Nero reigned from 54 AD to 68 AD. And the most important thing to recognize about this is that if it was written during the reign of Nero, it was written before 70 AD, which is significant, at least for one or more of the views of Revelation. I'll just let you know, one of the views holds that Revelation is talking about 70 AD, is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem that took place when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and slaughtered the Jews and took them away captive. One of the four views holds that the book of Revelation is predicting that. But it certainly can't be predicting that if it wasn't written before the event. So that view would have to have the book written in the reign of Nero. And that was a more popular view in an earlier century. Nowadays there's different vogues, fashions in theology. Nowadays the moderns prefer to make it Domitian's reign. Domitian's reign was later, from 81 to 96 AD. So obviously as much as a quarter of a century after the fall of Jerusalem. And if it was written during Domitian's reign, of course it couldn't be predicting the fall of Jerusalem, and that's an important thing to some people. Now the question is, which is true? Which time of suffering was it? Well, let's just look at the evidence for different suggestions. The early date is supported primarily by what we call internal evidence. The late date really rests more on what we call external evidence. Now, what do we mean by internal and external evidence? When scholars talk about the internal evidence for the authorship or date of a book, they're talking about information that the book tells you itself. What you find inside the book. What clues are found inside the book that tell you who wrote it, who it's to, what the situation was, when it was, and things like that. That's considered internal evidence. Notably, internal evidence is inspired because it's in the Bible. It's the Bible telling you about itself. Now there's also something called external evidence, and that is what was the testimony of the church fathers about this? What did, the earliest fathers say about this, about the authorship, about who received it, about what year it was written, and so forth? If it's someone outside the Bible talking about the Bible, like the church fathers or scholars or historians, that's called external evidence, because the evidence is external to the book. Now, the evidence that is adduced for the early date is usually internal evidence. That which is adduced for the later date is the strongest evidence is external. There is some internal evidence that is appealed to, but it's not very strong. The real strong evidence for the later date is external evidence, church fathers. And let me go through this real quickly. Why would anyone say it was written before AD 70 in the reign of Nero? First of all, because in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, it would appear that the temple was still standing. If it was, then that settles the matter right there. Because the temple was destroyed in AD 70. And if the temple was standing when Revelation was written, then it was written before the temple was no longer standing. It was written in the earlier period. In chapter 11, verse 1, it says, I was given a reed like a measuring rod, And the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Now, Jesus talked about how Jerusalem would be tread underfoot by the Gentiles till the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it would appear that this is saying that some portion of God's worship that's in the temple is going to be preserved. But some is going to be given over, the outward part is going to be given over to the Gentiles. Now, if this is saying that the temple, at least part of it, is going to be destroyed, then this would suggest that the temple had not yet been destroyed at the time this was written. And so that's one of the things pointed to for this early date. Okay, and then in chapter 13, there's something more. In chapter 13, we have the famous rise of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And the beast is given a name and a number. And in verse 18, most people know this verse if they know any part of Revelation. It says, Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, what does 666 mean? Well, we're told what it means. It's the number of a man. Well, what's that mean? Well, this is what we call a gematria. This is something that was fairly well known from the Roman times. All the languages spoken in the Roman world had something in common. They used the letters of their alphabet for their numeric system. We're familiar, for example, with Latin, which was, of course, the Roman language. Latin, we have the Roman numerals. Some of us are old enough, still learned how to read Roman numerals when we were in grammar school. You know, the letter X means 10, and the letter C means 100, and the letter V means 5. These were actually letters in the Roman alphabet, but they doubled as numeric values because they didn't have another set of numbers. Later, the Arabic numbers became what we use now in the English language. But the Romans, they used letters of their alphabet for numbers, as we know. So did the Greeks with their alphabet. The Greeks didn't have separate numbers. They had letters of their alphabet functioned as certain numbers. And so did Hebrew. The Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Romans all had that feature. Instead of using numbers in addition to letters, they used their letters for numbers. And that meant that any word you might choose, you could take the letters of it, and the ones that had numeric value, you could assign that number value to that letter, and you could total up the numbers in the word and get a total. And people did this a lot. There's actually graffiti from the Roman period has been found by archaeologists that says, graffiti says, 475 loves 386. And basically it's a coded message. You work out the number and you'll know who we're talking about, really. Because everyone's name could be reduced to a number in this way. Now, this was popular in the Roman world, and Jesus, who's given this prophecy, is saying, you want to know who the beast is? It's a man's name. It's a man's number. His number is 666. Now, the readers would have known what to do with that. They'd start looking for someone whose name, you could take the numbers of his name out to 666. And what's interesting is that John said, he that has wisdom, let him calculate the number of the beast. Now, he's writing to people in the first century. John was not writing a letter to us. He was writing a letter to 7 churches in Asia, most of which aren't even here anymore. He was writing to these readers saying, if you are wise, you can calculate who I'm talking about here. I'm giving you a clue. His number is 666. Now this tells us something. Whoever was the beast was alive at that time and could be identified by name by clever people. John was sure that not everyone could work it out, but those who are wise could. If you're wise, you can calculate this and figure out who I'm talking about. Now, he could never have said that if the beast was not somebody living at that time. And many scholars believe the beast he's referring to is Caesar Nero. Why? Because if you take the name Caesar Nero and translate it into Hebrew and add up the characters, it comes to 666. Doesn't work in Latin or Greek, but it works in Hebrew. Now some might object, well, why in the world would John, in referring to a Roman, use the Hebrew form of his name? For the same reason he gives the coded number. He's not interested in everybody knowing who he's talking about. This is written in code. Now the readers, although they were Greek-speaking, they knew some Hebrew. We know that because he has some Hebrew words in the book of Revelation. Though it's written in Greek, he has the word Maranatha. He's got the word, or no, that's in 1 Corinthians, but he's got the word Alleluia. He's got the word, the angel of the bottomless pits, given a Greek and a Hebrew name, Abaddon and Apollyon. And Abaddon's the Hebrew name and Apollyon's the Greek name. And you'll find in a number of cases, a Hebrew word is thrown in as if his readers know something about Hebrew. They're Christians. They use the Hebrew Scriptures. They didn't read Hebrew in all likelihood, but the wise ones probably could translate a name into Hebrew. And that would mean that the Romans, from whom this message is intended to be concealed, would not likely figure out who he's talking about, because they would know Greek and Latin, but they wouldn't probably know Hebrew in most cases. So if the name Caesar Nero was the name he had in mind and translated into Hebrew, it comes out to 666. Now there's nobody else that we know of, no other famous person who would fit any description of the beast at all from the first century, not even Domitian, has a name that works with. Now since that time, there's been scores of people that people have come up with, and Henry Kissinger, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter. All these people have been identified by someone or another as the Antichrist, and they've, in clever ways, made out their name to be 666. For example, Ronald Reagan. Ronald has 6 letters. Reagan has 6 letters, and I forget his middle name, but it has 6 letters too. It's got all 3 of his names have 6 letters. So someone said, he's definitely the Antichrist. I don't believe Ronald Reagan is the one, because I don't think that John's readers could be expected to calculate this number and say, I got it! It's Ronald Reagan for sure! First century readers would not have that ability. But his readers were expected to. And so this argues for the possibility, at least, that Nero is the emperor in question. Now there's another thing, too, that might point toward Nero. That's in chapter 17. In chapter 17, we got this vision of the beast again, with the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And the angel said, I'm going to give you an explanation of this. And you might as well, close the shop when the angel says he's going to give you the interpretation, because it's harder to understand the interpretation than the symbol. The first time you see it is in chapter 1, where John sees Jesus with 7 stars in his hand and 7 lamps. He's among the 7 lampstands. And the angel says, I'm going to tell you what those are. He said, the 7 lampstands, those are the 7 churches. And the 7 stars, those are the 7 angels of the 7 churches. And scholars to this day cannot answer who the 7 angels of the 7 churches refer to. But that was the explanation. The 7 stars was the symbol. They are the 7 angels. But who are the 7 angels? We are not given a clue anywhere in the book. Likewise, we're told that the 7 heads of the beast, I'm going to explain this angel. These are, let me read the explanation and see how clear this comes to you. Verse 9 and 10 of chapter 17. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Now that's not difficult, because Rome was called the city on the 7 hills. So almost everyone sees that 7 mountains as a reference to Rome. But then it says, there are also 7 kings. So the heads, they double as mountains and kings. It says 5 have fallen, 1 is, that'd be the 6th one, is, and the other has not yet come. And just so it doesn't seem overly clear, it goes on and says, and there's another one, verse 11, the beast that was and is not and is himself is also the 8th, and is of the 7 and is going to perdition. So in case you were starting to find it too easy to understand, he says the 7 heads are 7 kings. And besides that, there's an 8th one, and he's of the 7. And he goes, well, what are we talking about here? Well, it's very confusing. But one part is not very confusing. So there's 5 kings have fallen, and the 6th one now is. Most scholars believe that John is referring to emperors. He's telling his readers who's reigning at the time he's writing, at the time they're reading this. 5 kings have fallen, 1 now is. There's more to come. 1, 2, who knows how many more. But there's the 6th one is here now. The 6th emperor was Nero. Nero was the 6th emperor of the Roman Empire. And many people think that what John is saying here is, okay, there's the city on the 7 hills here. The 7 heads represent 7 mountains on which this city sits. But also, there are 7 kings. 5 of them are gone. The one that now is the 6th. And so many feel that John is telling his readers, this is referring to our present emperor, Nero, the 6th. Now, what might someone say who doesn't agree with that interpretation? Some might say that kings here means kingdoms, not emperors, but kingdoms. Like the first being the Babylonian, or we could even skip that and just start with the Egyptian. You got Egypt, you've got Assyria, you've got Babylon, you've got Media Persia, you've got Greece. That's 5 that had fallen, and Rome would be the 6th. So if kings means kingdoms, as some would say, then all that John is saying is currently the Roman Empire is the 6th kingdom. But since he has mentioned the 7 hills, which seems to point to Rome itself, then he talks about the kings individually. Many are more inclined to think he's talking about the emperors, and therefore identifying Nero as the reigning emperor at the time. Now there's one other set of circumstances that are important here, and that is that the situation in the church is thought to point to a period earlier than AD 70. Mostly because both the church of Smyrna and the church of Philadelphia were having conflicts with the Jewish people in their town. Now we know from the book of Acts that there's tremendous conflict in the early years of the church between the synagogue and the church. And for that matter, the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin were those who condemned Jesus and took him to Pilate. The Sanhedrin are those who stoned Stephen, the first martyr. The Sanhedrin are those who commissioned Saul of Tarsus to go out and persecute Christians around the world. The Sanhedrin are those who, after Saul of Tarsus became a Christian, sent out people to kill him. The Sanhedrin was a big persecutor of the church, and Paul was persecuted by the synagogues. In fact, many times Paul went into a Gentile town, preached, was well received, and then the Jews came to that town and stirred up the people and stoned him to death and dragged him out of the city. It was, in many cases, the Gentiles were receptive to the gospel, but the Jews were the main persecutors. Now that wasn't always the case. There were Gentile persecutors too. But it is thought that after the fall of Jerusalem, with the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the priesthood, the destruction of the Jewish state, the Jews scattered around the pagan world and slaughtered in great numbers by the Romans in AD 70, the Jewish people would be more or less demoralized and not so cocky as to be launching persecution against the Christians in their town. They'd be mainly trying to lick their own wounds and stay alive themselves. And that may be true, but that's not so certain. One reason it's not so certain is because even in the 2nd century, the Jews in Smyrna were still persecuting the church, long after AD 70. Because Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, was arrested by the Romans, and the church fathers tell us that as the Romans were taking him to burn him, the Jews were gathering the sticks to build the fire and urging on the crowds to call for his death. So even though Jerusalem had been destroyed long since, this is now in the mid part of the 2nd century, Polycarp was still suffering persecution from the Jews in Smyrna, the 2nd church that's mentioned here. So anyway, these are some of the things that make people think that it was written in the time of Nero. And they all have to do with internal evidence. Now, what about the later date? What evidence is there for the later date, Domitian's reign, from 81 to 96? Well, some internal evidence is appealed to. First of all, they say that in chapter 13 we read about emperor worship. Why? Because the beast requires everyone to worship him or be put to death in chapter 13. Now, scholars who make this argument are saying essentially that the beast is the emperor at the time of writing, and he is requiring people to worship him. And therefore, we have to look in history for an emperor that required people to worship him. And they say Domitian was the first one to do that. Nero persecuted Christians, but not requiring them to worship him. He persecuted Christians because he had burned Rome down himself, and then the people of Rome were so angry at Nero, he had to find someone else to blame for it, and he blamed the Christians because they were already kind of disliked. And so he did all this horrible persecution of the Christians to get the onus off of himself as the perpetrator of the fire that burned down Rome. It wasn't asking the Christians to worship him, but Domitian, they say, did require Christians to worship him and kill them if they didn't. However, you don't have to go as far as Domitian to find a conflict between the worship of God and the worship of the state. I mean, even when Jesus stood on trial before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" The Jews said, "We have no king but Caesar. Crucify him." They already were choosing Caesar long before even Nero's day to be instead of God, instead of Jesus. And we don't want this king, Jesus. We have our Caesar is our king. The conflict between loyalty to God and loyalty to Caesar was never absent from the time the Romans conquered Jerusalem 63 years or 73 years before Christ. And so all the emperors in one way or another demanded loyalty that many of the Jews felt belonged only to God, and could easily be represented as Revelation 13 represents it if they wished. There's another thing that some people think points to the later date, and that is the extent of the persecution. These churches were not in Rome, they were in Turkey. There was a sea, 2 seas between them and Rome. And therefore it is said that Nero's persecution, which was largely confined to persecution of Christians in the city of Rome, would not have reached these people. So there'd be no reason to write a letter like this to these people because the persecution was too far away. It was in Rome. It wasn't a general empire-wide persecution. But these same people say Domitian was the first emperor to issue persecution against Christians empire-wide. And therefore the churches in Turkey would be affected by this. And therefore the persecution here points to Domitian, not Nero as the emperor. Now in answer to this, one might easily say, but you don't really read of these churches being persecuted by the emperor. A couple of them were being persecuted by the synagogue. Some of them were being persecuted by the local Roman authorities. You don't need an empire-wide official persecution to have Christians being persecuted in their local towns. And what we read in the 7 letters is that some of these churches were persecuted by local people. And in fact, if Nero, the emperor, was officially persecuting Christians in Rome, it might be that throughout the empire it would encourage people who hated Christians anyway to say, well, if the emperor does it, we can get away with it. And we don't have any real evidence that there was an empire-wide persecution necessarily at the time of this writing. So it doesn't prove necessarily. And by the way, many historians say that there wasn't an empire-wide persecution even in Domitian's time. That's some disagreement about that among historians. There's also an appeal to what's called the Nero redivivus myth. What's the Nero redivivus myth? Well, historians tell us that after Nero died, his reign had been such a reign of terror that people could hardly believe it was really safe to go out again. And they hardly believed he was really dead. And a rumor circulated that Nero had simply gone east to the Parthians and that he would return a second time with the Parthian armies and conquer Rome again. So the people of Rome weren't really that at ease after Nero died because some doubted that he was really dead. And they thought he was going to come back. And they had this idea that there was going to be an emperor coming back like it'll be Nero. Now when Domitian reigned, many of the Romans called him a second Nero. And therefore some likened him, some called him the bald Nero. But he was like another Nero, another awful guy like Nero. Now scholars, and I don't sympathize with them on this, but scholars often say that the author here seems to sponsor that myth. Because in chapter 13 and verse 3, the beast is described this way: I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. Okay, so it's like he was dead, but oops, he's back. His deadly wound is healed. And scholars like to say this is an allusion to the Nero redivivus myth, that Nero would come back though he had died. Now, by the way, this is the argument the commentators give. I don't think there's any merit in this particular argument. I'm just telling you that right now. But you find the same information in chapter 13, verse 12. It says, he, the beast, the second beast, exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And then in verse 14, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. Now there's 3 times here it refers to this beast having a head wound, and he received a deadly wound in one of his 7 heads, but he lived. Some think this is saying that Nero, though he had died, was thought to have returned in Domitian, and therefore that this speaks about Domitian as the current emperor. Now I have a real problem with this argument. For one thing, I don't see any evidence here that this is talking about a resurrection. The beast had 7 heads. One of them got killed. The beast had 6 more good heads. It never died. The beast didn't die and come back. It suffered a mortal wound in one of its 6 heads. There's no reference to it coming back to life from being dead. Even the head that was wounded doesn't come back to life, but there's 6 good heads left. The beast can live on despite the mortal wound to one of its heads, and that's all that we're really told of it. There's no reference to someone dying and coming back here, although popular eschatology sometimes describes the Antichrist that way based on these verses also. But these verses don't say that. But more than that, if the writer is in fact referring to that, it almost sounds like he's sponsoring this myth as if it's true. As if Domitian really is a return of Nero. But he's not. And so, I mean, this argument has always seemed vacuous to me when I've heard it. I've heard it many times. Many commentators bring it up. Now, there's a couple of other things they bring up, and I'm going to give you a stretch break before we get into the 4 views themselves. And that is that the condition of the churches in Revelation are sometimes said to be such as would be more likely to be true in Domitian's reign than Nero's reign, for the following reasons. The church of Laodicea, in chapter 3, verse 17, is said to be wealthy. But Laodicea, the city, had suffered a severe earthquake in the early 60s. And it is argued it would not have recovered from this devastating earthquake so quickly as at some point in Nero's reign to be wealthy again. This argument is very subjective, of course. How long does it take for a city to recover from an earthquake? Depends, doesn't it? I mean, what does it? It doesn't actually say the city was wealthy. It says the people were saying, I am wealthy and I have need of nothing. This is almost talking about their spiritual attitude anyway. It might not even be talking about their wealth. In any case, who says they couldn't have recovered to the place where they could be described as wealthy? It was a banking city, and it had been destroyed many times by earthquakes. Laodicea was on a fault line, and it was destroyed by many earthquakes and rebuilt again. They had lots of money. The city had a lot of money, and they always rebuilt it pretty quickly. So this argument doesn't really tell us much. Now here's a much more difficult one, the Church of Smyrna. We know that the Church of Smyrna was around when Revelation was written because one of the 7 churches addressed is the Church at Smyrna. But Polycarp, who in a later century was the bishop of Smyrna, wrote a letter to the church in Philippi. And we have that letter. And the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians makes reference back to Paul's earlier letter to the Philippians, which we have in our Bible. And in his letter, Polycarp says, among you, meaning you Philippians, the blessed Paul labored, who are praised in the beginning of his epistle. For concerning you he boasts in all the churches who then alone had known the Lord, for we had not yet known him. Now the argument here is that Polycarp, who's at the church of Smyrna, said, we in Smyrna didn't know the Lord back then. Okay? And the argument goes, therefore, is that the church of Smyrna did not exist in Paul's lifetime. Because Polycarp said that we didn't know the Lord at that time. And Paul died probably around the year 67. So the argument is, if there was no church in Smyrna in Paul's lifetime, and Paul died in 67, then the church of Smyrna would have to be, come into existence sometimes after 67. Nero died in 68. There just doesn't seem time for the rise of the church of Smyrna in the reign of Nero, if the church of Smyrna was not there until Paul died. But that's reading something into Polycarp's statement that isn't there. Polycarp didn't say there was no church in Smyrna in Paul's lifetime. He said there was no church in Smyrna when Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians. Just read the passage. He's saying, when Paul wrote this letter to you, we didn't know Christ yet. Well, when did he write that? As far as we know, he wrote around the year between 60 and 62 AD. A full 8 years before 70 AD. The church of Smyrna could easily have come into existence in the time since then and still be in the reign of Nero. So it doesn't really prove anything against that early date, although this argument is often used. It's a fallacious argument. Then there's reference to the spiritual decline in Ephesus, Sardis, and Laodicea. By the time Paul wrote this, the church of Ephesus had left their first love. The church of Sardis had nothing good about them except their reputation. They had a name to live, but they were dead. The church of Laodicea had become lukewarm. These churches were established during the time of Paul's ministry in Asia. We're told that in the 3 years, in Acts it says the 3 years Paul spent in Asia, all of Asia heard the gospel, and these churches were established that time in Paul's second missionary journey, essentially, or third. And so this being so, they say, listen, if Paul started these churches up like in the 60s, or late 50s, they wouldn't have time before AD 70 to lose their first love, to become lukewarm, to have a name that they live but be dead. And I say, really? Where have you lived? How long does it take a church to lose their first love or to become lukewarm? It doesn't take any decade. When Paul left Galatia from his first missionary journey, he had to write a letter back to them before he'd even settled down back in his home church. He wrote to the Galatians, said they departed from the gospel. They've accepted a false gospel. The Corinthian church received a letter from him only months after he left them, and he said, you've got a man there who's living with his father's wife. You've got people getting drunk at communion. You've got people splitting the church following Paul, Apollos, and Cephas. This is the church only months after Paul left. How long does it take for a church to go bad? Not very long. It can happen while the apostles are still there, practically. And I've seen churches that grew up in the 70s that have long since been, left their first love and things like that. I mean, it doesn't take that long. So this argument, again, is entirely subjective. But the real argument for the late date, and I'm going to give you this quickly and then we're going to take a break. The real argument for the late date is this. Irenaeus, who wrote in 170 AD, just less than a century, or maybe just a century after the book of Revelation was written. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. And Polycarp was a disciple of the apostle John. And the apostle John wrote the book of Revelation. So it is thought that Irenaeus is pretty closely connected to John, only 2 generations removed. John discipled Polycarp, Polycarp discipled Irenaeus, and Irenaeus had something to say about the Revelation and its writing. And there's a very famous passage in Irenaeus' writings, which I will read to you. It's there in your notes. And based on this, most scholars believe that John wrote the book of Revelation in the reign of Domitian. And you'll see why as we read it. Irenaeus wrote this. He's talking about the number of the beast, 666. He says, now since this is so, and since this number is found in all the good and ancient copies, he means of the book of Revelation, and since those who have seen John face to face testify, and reason teaches us that the number of the name of the beast appears according to the numeration of the Greeks by its letters in it, he said reason tells us that. We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively the name of the Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in the present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, meaning John. For that was seen no very long time since, almost in our own day, toward the end of Domitian's reign. Okay? Now, something or someone was seen toward the end of Domitian's reign. The way this is worded, the most natural way to understand it is the vision was seen by John near the end of Domitian's reign. He talks about him that beheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen no very long time since, almost in our own day. What, the apocalyptic vision? Well then, in that case, the book of Revelation was written, according to Irenaeus, in the reign of Domitian. However, many people think this has been misunderstood for a number of reasons. One is that John speaks of the time of Domitian as not very long ago, almost in his own day. And yet he talks about very ancient copies of the book of Revelation in the very first line. He said it's found in all the good and ancient copies. Now, if a book already has good and ancient copies, would not the original from which they were copied be more ancient still? Would he speak about a book that was written almost in his own day, as he put it, not very long since, as being a book that now has very ancient copies in circulation of it? It doesn't seem to jibe well. Besides, the apocalyptic vision is not the only thing that he says was seen. In the underlined portion in the second line, it says, those who have seen John face to face testify. Who was seen? John was seen. Now likewise, in the second to the last line, he says, him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, for that was seen. What was seen? The vision or the one who saw the vision? Is he talking about people having seen John as late as Domitian's reign? Or is he talking about John having seen the vision in Domitian's reign? You see, if he's talking about when John was last seen, he's telling us nothing about when the vision was seen. The vision could have been seen decades earlier, but some people have seen John not very long ago, near the end of Domitian's reign. And this would actually make some sense, because the point he's making in the paragraph, as you can see, is I'm not going to tell you who the Antichrist is because John himself didn't tell us who he was. Now, that would make sense if he said, and John has been seen not very long ago. Some people I know even had a chance to know him, and he didn't tell them. His point is, it must not be important for us to know at this time who it is, because John, perhaps he's even saying very recently, I knew someone who saw him recently, in Domitian's reign. He didn't tell us what the number means, so we just have to be curious about it. Now that seems to be Irenaeus' thought. If he's trying to make that point and tells us, but the vision was seen not very long ago, what's that got to do with the point he's making? It's like it'd be a side issue. The point he's making is that John didn't bother to tell anyone what 666 means. That's his point. And it would be relevant to say, and John was seen not very long ago, and he still didn't say anything about it. But if he said, and the vision was seen not long ago, what's that got to do with whether John said it or not? I mean, to me, I'm having problems with this. I don't think it's necessarily being understood correctly to say that the vision was seen in the reign of Domitian. It could be. But there's another thing to consider, that is Irenaeus is not inspired. Irenaeus is still 2 generations removed from the situation and might be mistaken. After all, in Irenaeus' writings, he said that Jesus lived to be 50 years old before he was crucified. I don't know any scholars who believe that to be true. Most believe he died in his middle 30s. But Irenaeus said Jesus lived to be 50. Now we basically just disregard that and say, well, Irenaeus, I don't know where you got that figure, but we think you're wrong. And he could be wrong about other things too. The main thing to note is the strongest evidence for the late date is Irenaeus. And that's what we call external evidence, a non-inspired testimony. He could be right, but internal evidence would be more important. And you have to make your own judgment about that. I'm not going to decide for you which view is correct. I'm just saying these are the evidences that are out there. Now I want to give you a break. It's for about 5 minutes. If you'd come back at 8:30, I want to go through these 4 views, tell you what they are. Revelation is almost entirely about things still future from our point of view. All of them were future from his point of view, from John's point of view. But now, they're still future. So they haven't begun to be fulfilled yet. On this view, the first 3 chapters, which are the 7 letters to the 7 churches, pretty much have to do with things that were present in John's day, but that from chapter 4 on, it's all future, and still future. Now, they see the book dividing into 3 main segments, and these segments are defined in Revelation 1:19, where Jesus says in Revelation 1:19 to John, "Write the things that you've seen, the things which are, and the things which will come to pass after these things." Now, those are the 3 parts. Write what you've seen. Well, what had John seen? He saw this vision on the island of Patmos. He wrote it. It's chapter 1 is his writing what he has seen. Then, and write the things which are, that is, present realities in his day, which was the 7 letters to the 7 churches, describing the way the churches were in his day. And then the third, that's in chapters 2 and 3. Then the rest of the book belongs to the category, and the things that must take place after these things. Now, in the Greek, the word after these things is 2 Greek words, metatauta. Meta means after, and tauta means these things. Metatauta means these, after these things. And so in Revelation 1:19, he says, write what you've seen and what is now, and the things that will happen metatauta after these things. Well, chapter 4, verse 1 begins with the word metatauta, after these things. I heard a voice like a trumpet saying, come up here and I will show you things that must take place metatauta after these things. And I was caught up into heaven, and I saw a throne and him that was on it, and all this stuff in chapter 4. And so it is believed that the metatauta part of the book begins in chapter 4 and goes to the end. And this is the part that has not yet been fulfilled. This is still future even for us, as it was for them. There are some who believe, among futurists, there are some who believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. Some among futurists don't. Some believe in a mid-tribulation rapture. Some believe in a post-tribulation rapture. There's some who believe in what they call a pre-wrath rapture, which is like 3/4 of the way through the tribulation. So you get about 4 different positions people put the rapture in, but they're all futurists. They all believe not only the future, but not only the rapture, but everything in the book of Revelation after chapter 4 is still future. So that's futurism. And by the way, those who believe in the pre-trib rapture believe that John is the rapture in chapter 4, verse 1. When John hears the voice like a trumpet saying, come up here, and I was in heaven, they say that John being caught up into heaven is a picture of the church being caught up into heaven at the beginning of the tribulation. And that the rest of the book of Revelation covers the tribulation, the second coming, and the millennium, and the new heavens, new earth. All future. So that is the futurist view. Not all are pre-trib, but probably most futurists in America are pre-trib. Not necessarily around the world. Not so much. Now, one very great characteristic of the futurist view is that it takes a literal interpretation as much as possible. Futurists, especially dispensationalist futurists, believe that we're not really doing the right thing to take the book of Revelation symbolically. And they feel like they hold the higher moral ground by taking it more literally. And so they argue that, when a third of the ocean turns to blood, and a third of the fish die, and a third of the ships sink, and so forth, that's literally going to happen to a third of the oceans of the world at some point. When you read about 100-pound hailstones coming down on the earth, there's going to be literally a hailstone shower with 100-pound hailstones. And so they argue for this literalness of it, and they consider that they are the best interpreters because they alone do that. All the other interpretations take these things symbolically. Well, what's interesting is that even the futurists take most of the book of Revelation symbolically. For they don't know it, they just don't think about it. Like the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. They think that's a man. They think it's going to be a future world dictator. But if it is, it's not a beast. It's not got 7 heads or 10 horns. Everyone knows that's symbolic. In fact, the book of Revelation itself says the 7 heads represent 7 mountains and 7 kings, and the 10 horns, later you read of their 10 kings. We're not even talking about a man here, we're talking about a political complex of kings and kings. And yet it's all symbolic. A horn is not a king, a beast is not a man, and there's another beast that's got a mouth like a dragon and horns like a lamb, and it's another beast, the second beast, and most people think that's a man too, but it's not described as a man, it's described as a beast. Jesus is described as a lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns, and I don't know anyone who thinks Jesus really looks like that, nor should they. Even Jesus returning on a white horse in chapter 19 is often, recognized to be symbolic, since we don't know if there's horses in heaven. He didn't leave on a horse, and he's going to come back the same way he came, the same way he left, according to the angels in Acts chapter 1. He's going to return in the same manner. And so there's symbolism apparently. Even when the first 4 seals are broken, you see 4 horses. One's a white horse, one's a red horse, one's a black horse, one's a green horse. And the riders on these horses are symbolic for things. In fact, you can clearly see it when you get to the 4th horse, because the rider is death riding on the horse, personified as a man riding a horse, death. And then you've got Hades there following, another man named Hades. Well, Hades and death are not men. They are concepts or places or something, but they are not men. They don't ride on horses. And actually, I don't know anyone who really believes the 4 horses really are 4 literal horses. Most of them say, well, this one represents the Antichrist, this one represents war, this one represents famine. They recognize this is symbolism. And why not? It's apocalyptic literature. The only thing is that everybody takes much of the book of Revelation symbolically. It's just that futurists take some things literally that other people don't. And then they congratulate themselves that they've taken the higher moral ground because they're taking a more literal approach. But really, the things they take literally are chosen almost arbitrarily, as opposed to things they don't take literally. And the things they don't take literally, they still say they take literally, because they've been taught this is the literal interpretation of the book of Revelation. But when you say, what about the beast? Well, it's not, he's not a beast, it's a person, but it represents. But when they say represents, it's not literal. A symbol represents something. This is symbolic, just like all apocalyptic literature. Haman and Mordecai were not 2 dragons, but they were in Mordecai's dream. Esther is not a river, but she was in Mordecai's dream. This is apocalyptic imagery, very common. And so, the dispensational view especially, but all futurists tend to be able to take some things more literally. And that's really, I think, one of the advantages of the view at one level, because we tend to take things literally, and you're going to basically be able to convince more people of futurism if they tend to take things literally, and Westerners do. Modern Westerners don't read apocalyptic literature as a rule, and we do tend to be more literalistic. It's a sort of a Western way of thinking, a Greek way of thinking that we've picked up in our culture. And therefore, if someone says, well, the Bible says literally 100-pound hailstones are going to come from the air. Well, it doesn't say literally 100-pound hailstones. It says 100-pound hailstones. It doesn't say literally. The question is it literal or is it not literal? Let's not beg the question here. And many times these commentators from the futurist view, they say, the Bible literally says that the ocean's going to all turn to blood. Well, it says the ocean's going to turn to blood, but it doesn't say that that's literal. The question is it? That's something that has to be decided on other considerations. The book of Revelation doesn't anywhere in it say, literally. That's what the futurist commentators add to it, because they know that Western readers trying to make sense of something are more likely to be impressed by someone taking a literal interpretation of something. But a reader in the 1st century wouldn't have been more impressed with that. Say, what are you talking about? Don't you know what kind of literature you're looking at here? And so, anyway, one of the strengths of the futurist view is it does appeal to our tendency to take things literally, but that might not really be a strength at all. It is also widely held and taught by respected men, great men. And I really think this is probably one of the biggest drawbacks to anyone even questioning the futurist view. If it's wrong, how can my pastor so-and-so be so wrong? My pastor so-and-so has built his whole ministry on teaching the futurist view of Revelation. And he's a great man. He's a great teacher. Well, I won't deny that he may be a great man and great teacher. Great men and great teachers can be wrong about things. And if they build their entire ministry on something that's controversial, they take a great risk of their whole ministry being wrong. I don't think people should build a whole ministry on something so controversial as that, because if they're wrong, then their whole ministry is discredited. I have my own views of Revelation that I hold to, but if they're ever proven wrong, that'll just be a little tiny bit of my ministry that I have to say, oops, I was wrong about that, because my ministry is not all about Revelation. It's the only book of the Bible I've written a commentary on, but it's the least important book to my thinking, because Whatever Revelation is about, it's going to happen or did happen or whatever, I mean, okay, I understand it or I misunderstand it. Big deal. Even if it is talking about a future tribulation and Antichrist, what's it going to do me good to know about it? Especially if I'm going to be raptured in chapter 4, verse 1. What do I care? And if I'm not going to be raptured, I'm going to be here anyway, I'll recognize it soon enough when the Antichrist comes and starts wanting to laser tattoo my hand or put a chip in my hand. I'll say, oh, I get it. That was future. I recognize that. It says 666 right there. I know what that's about. Why do I need to know in advance? I can recognize the devil's work when it shows up. I get phone calls on the radio all the time from people, oh, you got to believe it, this future scenario that they have for Revelation. And I say, well, okay, now you believe that, I might believe something else. What difference does it make in my life or yours to believe one way or the other? Are you following Jesus? Am I following Jesus? So what the heck difference does it make what you think about Revelation or what I think about Revelation? You say, well, you got to be ready for it. You got to be prepared. I'm ready. I'm ready for anything. No, you don't expect it to be such and such. Well, I'll find out when it comes, won't I? I mean, you can expect whatever you want, but you know what I have found? I've been a Christian for 50 years. A lot of people haven't been Christians that long. They're very gullible about these things. They say, oh, the 4 blood moons, that's definitely the end of the world. Yeah, do you know in 1970 when I was 16, Hal Lindsey said that the generation that saw Israel become a nation had to be still living when the end of all things occurred. And that Israel became a nation in 1948, so he said a generation's 40 years, so by 1988 it all has to be run its course. And you've got to have a 7-year tribulation before the end and the rapture before that, so you've got to have the rapture no later than 1981. And Hal Lindsey in a television interview said, the rapture's got to happen in 1981. He says, I'm making that prediction right now. He said, I'm either a hero or a bum. He says, we'll know in 1981. Sure enough, he's right about that. Now we know. But the thing is, the people who take the futures view keep being wrong. So even if I hold the futures view, it doesn't tell me anything for sure. Because whatever I think is going to happen, I might be as wrong as everyone else has been so far. After all, every future's been wrong so far who thought they were living in the last days. We're not the first decade of Christians to think that, the book of Revelation is being fulfilled before our very eyes. There's been many generations of Christians who thought exactly the same thing. And I'm not trying to say it can't happen in our time. I'm saying, I believe Jesus could come today. That's my conviction. I believe Jesus could come today. I'm ready. Are you? And whether I know about the future or not is not going to make a hill of beans difference in the way I live my life, or whether I'm ready to meet Jesus, or whether I'm ready to suffer persecution. When I was a totally convinced futurist about Revelation, I was still ready to die a martyr. In fact, I wanted to go to Russia back when it was the USSR, and I wanted to preach in the underground church and hopefully get caught. When I was a teenager, I wanted to go and be a martyr. I thought, boy, there's nothing greater than that, to die for Jesus. I mean, I believed in a pre-trib rapture, but I was still ready to die a martyr if necessary. I mean, why not? You got to die some way. What better way, So, I mean, in other words, knowing the future doesn't make any difference in the way a Christian should live their life. If I knew Jesus was coming tomorrow, I'd live my life today the same way I lived it today. If I think he's not going to come back for 1,000 years, I'll still live my life the same way as if I think he's coming next week. What should I do different? In other words, while I'm not saying the futurist view must be wrong, I'm saying that the belief that we must know what the future holds is a wrong attitude, I think. The futurist view of Revelation could be right, but the idea that it has to be right and I need to know is something I just have no sympathy with. I just think, why is that so awful? Why is a whole ministry built on predictions about the future, which are not any more likely to be correct than the predictions that were made 20 years, 40 years, 100 years ago by the same people reading the same book, making the same predictions about their own day? Maybe someone's going to get it right someday, but how do I know it's us? How about if I just live my life for Jesus and don't worry too much about speculative things about the future? Now, if you're all into the future, that's fine. I mean, that's your business. I'm telling you, my attitude's a little different about it, and it doesn't carry a lot of weight with me when someone says, oh, you've got to be ready for the Antichrist thing. I thought you said I'm going to be raptured before then anyway, so why do I even have to know who the Antichrist is? I don't even have to care, right? But it is widely held by respected teachers. What many people don't know is it's only been widely held for a very short time. And those teachers were trained in it by teachers who were trained in it, by teachers who were trained in it, by teachers from denominations that officially hold this doctrine called dispensationalism in most cases. And that view arose in 1830. Now, futurism didn't. Dispensationalism is a certain brand of futurism that most futurists hold to today, but not all. Dispensationalism arose in 1830, but futurism rose earlier than that. Because the historicist view, remember I said the historicist view is the Protestant view for so long. Why was it called the Protestant view? The historicist view teaches and taught that the papacy is the beast. We'll talk about that in a moment. But because the reformers were all historicists, and they all taught that the papacy, the popes, are the beast, this kind of made the Pope look bad in their preaching. And so there was a Jesuit named Francisco Ribera in the late 1500s. Francisco Ribera, a Spanish Jesuit priest. And he was concerned about the Protestant teaching that the Pope was the Antichrist. And so he wrote a commentary on Revelation and said, no, the Pope's not the Antichrist. The Antichrist is a man who's going to arise in the end times in the last 3.5 years. In a future tribulation. He's going to be an individual, not an institution. He's going to be a world dictator. He's going to be a persecutor of the people of God. And he's going to be an individual Antichrist, and Jesus is going to destroy him when he comes. That's what Francisco Ribera wrote, to redefine the Antichrist from being the Pope to being something that hadn't yet arrived. This was the beginning of the futurist view, and everyone who studies it knows this. Many futurists know this. Francisco Ribera is the founder of the futurist view in the late 1500s. No Protestant would touch that view with a 10-foot pole for about 200 or 300 years, because they saw it as a Catholic view which was invented simply to rehabilitate the image of the Pope. And Protestants weren't interested in playing that game, and so Protestants refused to get into the futurist view. What happened is in the year 1827, a man technically Protestant, his name was Samuel Maitland. He was the librarian to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Archbishop of Canterbury is to the Church of England what the Pope is to the Church of Rome. And the Church of England is technically Protestant, although they're Catholic in all ways except the Pope. They've got their Archbishop of Canterbury instead of the Pope, but their doctrines are essentially Roman Catholic in most other respects. Now, Samuel Maitland was the librarian to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he read Francisco Ribera's stuff and thought, hey, that sounds good to me. And he wrote, as the first Protestant, hundreds of years after the death of Ribera, he promoted Ribera's futurist view in Protestant circles. Only a few years later, in 1830, 3 years later, John Nelson Darby in England, in the Plymouth Brethren movement, incorporated the futurist view as part of his dispensational system. And the futurist view was carried along with dispensationalism throughout England and America initially, where it took hold very greatly, and then to a lesser degree in other parts of the world where American missionaries went. And so today, futurism is pretty much the big popular view among Protestants as well. But its origins are well known. I mean, anyone who studies church history knows the name of Francisco Ribera, knows about Samuel Maitland, knows about John Nelson Darby. Once in a while I'll meet a dispensationalist who says, no, that's not true. And I say, well, you can say it if you want to. All the historians disagree with you, and you'll disagree with yourself if you read the history. It's not controversial. There's no other theories about where it came from. It's universally known from the church historians. Do your own research and you'll find it to be true. And you can, with the computer, internet, you can do all this, find this out really easy. All right, so this is, the disadvantages of the futurist view, first of all, is it makes the book 90% irrelevant to Christians. If Christians are going to be raptured, chapter 4, verse 1, then the rest of the book, we might as well not even read it. What's it matter? It's irrelevant to us. Also, it makes it irrelevant to the original readers. A strange thing. To write an epistle to suffering Christians in the first century and tell them about things that will happen 2,000 years later than their time. Well, that's real comforting. Thanks. Also, the view does not adequately recognize the symbolic character of the apocalyptic literature. Now, there's some statements in the book that futurism really has a hard time with. They might say they don't, but they do. Look at Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. Revelation 1:1 says, "But revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place." Shortly, these things are going to take place, he said to people living 2,000 years ago. The future says, well, they haven't happened yet. So these things were really 2,000 years off. Look at verse 3, chapter 1, verse 3. "Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and keep those things that are written in it. The time is near." These things are shortly going to take place. The time is near. He's writing to people who are now dead for 2,000 years, but who are alive receiving this message and this word of encouragement. Was he talking about something 2,000 years off and saying it was about to happen? It's near. It's shortly going to take place. Then look at chapter 22. Chapter 22, very interesting, verse 10. It says, "And the angel said to me," John says, "Do not seal the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand." Well, we've heard already the time is at hand, but he said, don't seal the words of the prophecy of this book. This is directly in contrast to Daniel chapter 12, where Daniel said, what are the end of these all things? And the angel said, don't worry about Daniel. You're going to die. You're going to live to be old. You're going to die. In the end times, you'll be raised into your estate. But he said, seal it up. It's not for your generation to worry about. Seal up the words of the prophecy, Daniel was told. John is told, don't seal up the words of the prophecy. The time is near. Now, I mean, it's very clearly a contrast. Daniel's prophecies were not going to be quickly fulfilled, so he's told to seal the book up and put it away for a while. Another generation would benefit from it. John is told, don't you dare seal this book. It's coming now. It's near. And therefore, there's this note of urgency throughout the book. In fact, I mentioned Revelation 1:19, where the three parts of the book, write what you've seen, the things that are now. The third, actually in the Greek, says, and the things that are about to take place after these things. Actually, the Greek word is mello, M-E-L-L-O. It means about to take place. About to is what it means. It says, write the things that are about to take place. So, certainly, John has the impression and gives the impression, and it's the angel speaking to him that gives him that impression, that these are things that must shortly take place. The time is at hand. Don't seal the book up. It's near. It's about to happen. Now, people who hold to the futurist view really have to do something with verses like that, because they're saying it wasn't about to happen. It was 2,000 years off. Now, of course, the easiest answer that you usually hear about this is, well, you know, a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years. And 1,000 years like a day. So really, even though it was 2,000 years off, it was really only a couple days off as far as God wasn't lying when he said the time is near. It's only 2 days, like a day is 1,000 years. Now, my answer is this. If the book was written to God, then it could use his time period to communicate its message. But, however, if it's written to God, even 1,000,000 years would be near. And if we're saying it's near as God reckons time it's near, you might as well say nothing at all about the time, because as God reckons time, 5,000,000 years might be near. It tells us nothing about when it's going to be fulfilled. Why all these references to when it's going to happen when it's really some, indistinct, almost infinitely large distance of time could be? It's more confusing to say anything about it at all. Why not just say these things are going to someday happen? Why keep saying it's about to happen? It's shortly going to take place. Don't seal the book. Its time is near. This is not written to God, it's written to people. And people do not think of 2,000 years as a short time. And if a suffering church is given information, don't worry, these things are going to happen soon. And they're comforting things. And they die and go to heaven and say, it's 2,000 years off. Sorry, I thought you'd know that. I don't think they would know that. Now, some futurists say, well, shortly doesn't mean shortly, like soon. Shortly means quickly. And they say it doesn't mean it's going to happen soon from John's point of view, but when it does happen, it'll happen in a quick, rapid way. Well, that is true about the word shortly. The word shortly can mean quickly. But there's too many other words used too that don't mean quickly, like the time is near and it's about to take place. I mean, that doesn't use that word. Let's face it, there's a strong emphasis on the immediacy of the fulfillment given throughout the book. And the futurist view does not really do adequate justice to that. Let's talk about the historicist view now. As I said, the historicist view holds that the book of Revelation covers all of church history from John's day to the second coming of Christ. It holds to a principle called a year for a day principle. And that means that when you find a number of days or a number of days mentioned, it really means that same number of years. Now, why would you think that? Well, there's a couple things in the Old Testament they base that on. They say when Israel sent the spies into the land to spy out the land of Canaan, they were there for 40 days. When the people rebelled against God, God said, I'm going to give you 40 years wandering in the wilderness, a year for a day. Well, that's true. Of course, that doesn't exactly translate into a principle of interpretation of prophecy, since there were no prophecies involved and no interpretation involved. God made their wandering in the wilderness a year correspond to each day that they spied. But that hardly gives us a principle to interpret prophecy by. The other one is that in Ezekiel, I think it's in chapter 4 or 5, Ezekiel is told to lie on his side. On one side he lies for a certain number of days, and on the other side he lies for another certain number of days, and these, he is told, represent the years of judgment on Israel and Judah. So there we actually do have a day representing a year. But that's the only time in any of the prophetic books that we have that, and there's many time periods in the Bible that are not taken that way. But according to the historicist view, the numbers in the book of Revelation are taken that way. So you've got the beast, this is the most important one, the beast's blasphemies continue for 1,260 days. Now, literal days, that'd be 3.5 years. But on a year for a day principle, that's 1,260 years. Now, if the papacy is the beast, as historicists all generally believe, and the papacy really rose, most people identify it beginning with Pope Gregory the Great around the year 600. Then 1,260 years from then would be like 1860. And so around the middle 1800s, Protestants, who were historicists, started looking for the immediate second coming of Christ. One of those was William Miller and the Millerites, who actually, he set a date, I think it was in the 1840s, he set as a date that he felt that Jesus was going to come back, and his followers went up on a mountain and waited for Jesus. Didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, they call that the Great Disappointment. That's actually church history refers to that Millerite disappointment as the Great Disappointment. From that movement eventually arose the movement under Ellen G. White, which was the Seventh-day Adventist movement. And they are pretty much the only people around today who still seem to hold the historicist view of Revelation. The reason that most have abandoned it is twofold. One is that most got sucked up in the futurist view and gave up the historicist view. And, once you hold the historicist view, the futurist view, you can't hold the historicist view anymore. But the other, I think the disappointment was the problem. When the papacy didn't fall in 1860 or anywhere thereabouts, it tended to look like there were some flaws with the view. Also, this view holds that the 7 seals are the fall of the Western Empire of Rome to the barbarian invasions, that the 7 trumpets are the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire to the Saracens and the Turks, and that the 7 bowls of judgment in chapter 16 are a reference to the French Revolution. Trouble is, once you get past the 7 bowls of judgment, there's nothing left. And the French Revolution was a couple hundred years ago. So it's like we ran out of revelation, but we didn't run out of history yet. And so when the papacy didn't fall in the 19th century, there were many who were disappointed. Many bailed from the historicist view, and you don't find many now. I do know some people who are not Seventh-day Adventists who do hold the historicist view, but they're very few. And there are some groups in the United States kind of meeting around this kind of view that the historicist view is correct still. But that's the historicist view. It is mostly a thing of the past, except pretty much in the Seventh-day Adventist Revelation seminars, where they still teach that view. So that's a second view. A third view is the preterist view. Now, remember, the word preterist just means fulfilled in the past. And most preterists today argue that it was fulfilled in the past through the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Though many preterists in earlier days applied it to the fall of Rome in the 5th century. But these people believe that this isn't going to cover all of church history, it's just cover this one judgment event which is now long past in early centuries of the church. One of the advantages of this view is that it makes really good sense of those verses that we said the futurists have a hard time with. When John says these things are about to happen, this is about to take place, this is going to happen shortly. Don't seal the book because it's at hand. These verses make a lot of good sense if it was written during the reign of Nero, who died in 68, and if its predictions are of the Jewish war, which began in 66 and ended in 70. If that is indeed the scenario, if it was written in the reign of Nero, you can take all those messages of near fulfillment very literally. That's a literal interpretation of Revelation. Notice. And in fact, it's interesting. It's the futurists who always tell us they take a literal view of Revelation, but they take the most non-literal view of these time statements. And the time statements are found in the beginning and end of the book, which are not so much symbolic. The symbolism is mostly in the visions. You know, the statements about the near fulfillment are in the first 3 verses, the introduction. This is the revelation that was given to John and blah, 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 about things that must shortly take place. That's before the symbolic visions even begin. And then at the end in the epilogue, the angel says, don't seal it up, the time is near. That's in kind of the close. The middle part is all those visions of dragons and beasts and things like that. Now, what's interesting is that the preterist takes the beginning and the end literally because it's not written in symbols. And says it's shortly going to take place. They take the middle part symbolically because it's written symbolic visions. The futurist does the opposite. They take the visions literally as much as they can, but then they have to take symbolically these statements about the time is near. They have to rework those. Preterism doesn't have a problem with those statements. In fact, those statements work best for the preterist, actually. If the preterist view is true, it's relevant to the original readers, something we would expect to find in an epistle written to original readers. It would be something relevant to their times. Now, they weren't in Jerusalem, but the destruction of the Jewish state and the Jewish religion and the temple and the priesthood and all that was going to have tremendous impact on the relations of the church to the Jews throughout the empire, because in many cases until that time the Jews were persecuting the Christians. But that kind of stole their thunder in a way, kind of took the wind out of their sails, and it would have a relevance to the original readers. And that's why Jesus tells the church of Smyrna and the church of Philadelphia, both of which are persecuted by Jews, that he's soon going to reverse that situation for them. It also agrees impressively with Josephus' writings of the Jewish war. Now, many people have not read Josephus. His volumes are very huge. Josephus was a Jew living in the 1st century who participated in that war. He was a general, a Jewish general in the Jewish war. Early in the war, he was captured by the Romans. And when he began to see the massive force of the Romans, he knew Jerusalem was doomed. And he felt the only hope for the Jews is to surrender and save their lives. Same thing Jeremiah told his generation. Jeremiah, when Jerusalem was about to be destroyed by the Babylonians, Jeremiah told his generation, surrender and you'll live. Resist and you'll die. Well, that's what Josephus did in his generation. He told the Jews, you need to surrender. He actually became an interpreter for Titus, the Roman general, who conquered Jerusalem. And he stood at the wall, and Josephus tried to persuade the Jews to surrender so they'd live and not die, just like Jeremiah had done before. Well, the Jews threw rocks and hit him in the head and stuff like that. And the Jews today even think of Josephus as a traitor to the Jewish cause. But he loved the Jews. And he wrote their Jewish history. He wrote something called Antiquities of the Jews, a complete history of the Jews. He also wrote another major work called The Wars of the Jews, about the Jewish war. In great detail, he told about that 3.5-year war. It's interesting how few books other than the New Testament have survived from the 1st century, but Josephus' work has, interestingly enough. It might be even providential. If you were a preterist, you'd probably think so, because without Josephus' book, we wouldn't know what happened in the Jewish war. We don't have any other eyewitnesses who've recorded it except Josephus, but we do. And when you read Josephus, it's amazing how many things in Josephus correspond with the predictions of Revelation. I mentioned the 100-pound hailstones. Josephus mentioned specifically he had never read Revelation. He was a Jew, not a Christian. He was a Jewish general. But as he's telling about the war, he says, at one stage the Romans were using catapults, throwing 100-pound stones over the walls and killing people inside the city. He said because the stones were easily seen, because they were dark against the day sky, they painted the stones white and threw them. And he said each stone weighed about 100 pounds. Now he didn't know that Revelation talked about a judgment involving 100-pound hailstones pelting the city, but he kind of tells a story that makes sense. You know, where Revelation a couple times talks about the sea turning to blood, the ships sinking, the fish dying, corpses and all. Josephus didn't know about the book of Revelation, but he told about a battle that took place on the Sea of Galilee. The Romans chased the Galilean Jews into the water. The Jews got in boats, and they went out into the Sea of Galilee to try to escape, but the Romans pursued them on boats, and they pursued them, shooting them with arrows and hacking them with swords and so forth, and said many times the Jews would jump out of their boats and swim to the Romans hoping for safety, to surrender. They put their hands on the boats, and the Romans would cut their hands off and cut their heads off. And Josephus said, the next morning, one could see the sea all bloody with all the wrecked ships and all the swollen corpses. And you think, whoa. That's like exactly what Revelation said happened with one of those trumpets that sounded. And you get this kind of stuff. It doesn't prove anything, but it's interesting. That is to say, if we didn't have Josephus, we wouldn't know whether these kinds of things had happened or not. Because we have Josephus, and he didn't even know about the book of Revelation, we have amazing confirmations of a great number of things that the book of Revelation seems to describe. So those are advantages of the preterist view. Now there's some disadvantages of the preterist view. One of them is it's totally vulnerable to the date of writing. If those who hold to the later date of writing are correct, that is, if it was written in the reign of Domitian, the preterist view is nothing. Doesn't work. If it was written in 96 AD, that's 25 years after the fall of Jerusalem. Certainly the book of Revelation would not be written prophesying an event that happened a quarter of a century earlier. The only way that the preterist view can be correct is if it was written before 70 AD. That is possible, but disputed. It remains a matter of dispute, and that's why I went over the material earlier. There are some arguments against it and arguments for it. And the preterist view depends 100% on the early date. If the early date is not correct, the preterist view is not correct. And the preterist view is the only view vulnerable on that point. Because all the other views could be correct whether it was written during the reign of Nero or the reign of Domitian. The futurists could be right no matter when it was written. The historicists could be right no matter when it was written. Even the idealists, as we'll find, could be right no matter when it's written. But the preterist cannot be right if it's written in the later date. And that's why the reign of Nero as the date of writing is so important to the preterists. It's not as important to anyone else, because of course the whole preterist view stands or falls on that date being legitimate. The other weakness of it, or what is thought to be a weakness of it, is it is said that the preterist view had a beginning similar to the futurist view by a Spanish Jesuit named Luis de Alcazar. It is true, late in the 16th century, just like Francisco Ribera wrote the first futurist view, another Jesuit named Luis de Alcazar wrote a preterist commentary on Revelation. His teaching was that the first half of the book was fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem, and the second half of the book was fulfilled in the fall of Rome. Now he was doing it for the same reason that Francisco Ribera was doing it. They both wanted to rehabilitate the Pope, because the historicist view of the Protestants was the dominant view among Protestants, and it was very convincing. And therefore, to help the Pope out and try to make it seem like the Pope isn't the Antichrist and that the book of Revelation isn't about the Pope, just like Francisco Ribera turned the Antichrist into a future figure, Luis de Alcazar made the book of Revelation about things earlier, preterist. Now some people say, well, the preterist view then, it's got as shaky a foundation as the futurist view. Both views were started by Jesuits trying to defend the Pope. But there's one difference here, and that is that Luis de Alcazar was not the founder of the preterist view. There were preterists long before him. 1,000 years before him, there were preterists. For example, in the 6th century, 1,000 years before Alcazar, there was a commentator, Christian commentator on Revelation named Arethusa. There was another one named Andreas of Cappadocia. Both of them took a preterist view of Revelation. I've got some quotes here from Arethusa. When he's commenting on Revelation 6:12, he said, "Some refer this to the siege of Jerusalem by Vespasian." Some in his day thought that Revelation 6:12, which is the sixth seal being broken, was a reference to the fall of Jerusalem, or to the siege of Jerusalem in the days of Vespasian. That's in 70 AD. On Revelation 7:1, where the 144,000 are sealed, Arethusa writes, quote, "Here then were manifestly shown to the evangelist what things were to befall the Jews in their war against the Romans, in the way of avenging the sufferings inflicted upon Christ." That's a preterist view. That this was a judgment of God on the city that had crucified Christ. And Jesus had predicted that not one stone would be left standing on another when their enemies would come. Jesus predicted that in Luke 19. He wept over Jerusalem. He said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if only you had known those things that are for your peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes." Now, he says, your enemies are going to come and cast a siege around you, and they'll level you to the ground, and your children within you, not one stone will be left on another. And that happened in 70 AD. He said the same thing when he left the temple in Matthew 24, verse 2. He said, "Do you see this temple? Not one stone's going to be left standing on another. It'll be all thrown down." That happened in 70 AD too. So, in other words, that view of Revelation was taken by Arethusa. At Revelation 7:4, Arethusa wrote, quote, "When the evangelists received these oracles, the destruction in which the Jews were involved was not yet inflicted by the Romans." In other words, Arethusa said this was written before AD 70. And he said it was about that. So even if it is true that Luis de Alcazar wrote a preterist commentary on Revelation, he was certainly not the first. 1,000 years before him, Arethusa did, and another guy, Andreas of Cappadocia, around the same time wrote one. And so, of course, we don't know, whether preterism is true or not is has got to be decided on a different basis than any of that. But the truth is that while the futurist view really did arise in the late 1500s from Francisco Ribera, the preterist view did not originate with Luis de Alcazar. It was around a long time before he was ever born. It may not have been the original view of the early church. For example, we read a quote from Irenaeus before our break. He apparently was not a preterist, because he thought the Antichrist was still future, and he was writing in 170, But he thought it was coming in his day. Actually, Irenaeus believed the number 666 stood for the word Latinus, which means Roman. So, Irenaeus did believe the Roman Empire was the beast. So he would have been like seeing, he would have been seeing it as fulfilled kind of in his time, but he lived a long time after the fall of Jerusalem, and he didn't recognize it in a preterist sense. So some of the church fathers did not, and some did. Irenaeus did not. Arethusa did, and Andreas did. Okay, now the last view to consider is the idealist view. And as I said, this view is different from the others in that the other views try to assign a time of fulfillment of the prophecies, either in the future or in the past, or spread out over the whole age of the church. The idealist view doesn't do that. The idealist view says, there's certain timeless truths that are always true at all times, and these visions are simply symbolic descriptions of those truths. Well, what truths? Well, truths like the sovereignty of God. Throughout the book of Revelation, you see God sovereignly bringing judgment, sovereignly raising up and bringing down. God's sovereign activity in the world is a main theme of Revelation. They say, well, that's a truth all the time. And we see that depicted in these symbolic visions. The spiritual warfare between Christ and Satan, and between the church and Satan, is depicted. That's an ongoing thing for all time. It's not certain events. It's like a reality, timeless reality. And so the idealist view holds that things like that, the sovereignty of God, the spiritual warfare, the victory of Christ over the powers of evil, the vindication of the martyrs in heaven, these things are always true, and they come up again and again in the book of Revelation. So the view would be sort of like taking the book of Revelation to be sort of like maybe we would take Pilgrim's Progress. How many of you are familiar with Pilgrim's Progress? You should be. It's the most widely read book in the world besides the Bible. John Bunyan wrote it. He was a Puritan writer. He wrote it in jail because it was illegal in England in his day to preach the gospel outside of church. He was outside of church preaching the gospel. He went to jail. While he was in jail, he wrote a book called Pilgrim's Progress, which, as I say, is the best-selling book in the world besides the Bible, and should be. It's an incredible book. It begins, I dreamed, and I saw a man with a burden on his back. And he seemed to be very disturbed and very despondent. And he talked about this man, how this man was visited by somebody named Evangelist, who brought him a scroll, and he saw the gospel. He said, go to this wicket gate and go through there, and you'll find a cross there. You go to the cross and your burden will fall off your back. And so he went through there. He had to go through the slough of despond, and one of his companions that started out with him, Pliable, started going with him, but turned back from the slough of despond. And after he got through past the cross, he took the path to the celestial city, and he met Worldly Wise Man and Mr. Legalist, and he met all these people, none of whom are real people. The story's not historical, but no one can have any trouble seeing what it's teaching. Everyone in it symbolizes some spiritual truth. And the book is an incredibly profound allegory of the Christian life. Totally edifying. If you haven't read it, shame on you. Get it and read it, The Pilgrim's Progress. When you do, you'll see a book that's similar to what the idealists think about the book of Revelation. The idealists think this is not talking about a true story. It's not talking about specific events. It's talking about Christian truths that are depicted in these dramatic ways. That Christ is the victor, that Satan is the loser, that there's a spiritual warfare between Christians and the devil, and they triumph over him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they love not their lives to the death. And when they die, as far as they're victorious in heaven, reigning on thrones with Christ, and blah, 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 all this. Now, see, this is the idealist view. This doesn't look for any kind of fulfillments of anything in the book of Revelation. It's more seeing the spiritual lesson behind everything. Now, what would be the advantage of this view? Well, one advantage would be that it avoids the difficulty of harmonizing the visions with anything historical, either future or past. And therefore, it doesn't have to be very specific about connecting things with history, because it doesn't claim any such connections. But the real disadvantage of the idealist view is that in Revelation 1:1, it says, this is a prophecy about things that must shortly come to pass. Actual events, apparently, things that must take place after this. In other words, the book of Revelation itself says it is a prophecy about events that are going to happen. It says they'll happen shortly, and the time is at hand. So the idealist view doesn't recognize that and seems to be mistaken on that point. So what do? We've got, each view has some strengths and some weaknesses. Each view, by the way, is held by a great number of Christians. You know how many people hold the futurist view. It's probably the view you hold. You know how many people were Protestants in the days of the Reformation. They held the historicist view, and some people still hold it today. The preterist view, if you hadn't heard it before, it's a growing view too. In fact, most of the new writers on Revelation are probably promoting that, and it's causing real consternation among futurists, and they're writing books against it. But the idealist view, it's been around a long time too, but it's been very popular among certain British evangelicals since the 1940s especially, but it's been around longer. You can find elements of it centuries ago in writings of church fathers, but all the views have been around for some time now, and all of them have people who are very smart, godly, evangelical, orthodox Christians who hold them. It's obvious that there's not one view that just holds the monopoly on all the smart Christians hold this view, or all the people who really know their Bibles hold this view, or all the people who really are uncompromising hold these views. All these views are held by people who are very uncompromising, Bible scholars who love the Lord, who are conservative in their theology, but these views have been around. All of them have been around. It's just that we live in this little bubble here where we've only lived for, less than 100 years, and during that 100 years, the futurist view has been the popular view in America primarily. You go to England, most of the evangelical scholars hold the idealist view, not the futurist view. Canada also, I think. But the thing is here, it's a mistake to say, well, I'm going to hold this view because the people I respect hold it. I think it's better to say, I'm going to look into this until I can reach some convictions of my own about it. And if I disagree with somebody, I'm not going to make that a federal case. It doesn't have to be a big deal. Who cares? If I decide to be an idealist or a preterist or a historicist, and someone else says, no, I think the future is true, more power to you. Does that have to have any impact on our fellowship or our Christian walk? I can't see how it would. And by the way, I think many people are reaching the conclusion, I'm one of them, that the correct view is probably a combination of more than one. I will say this, the idealist view, though it's different than the others, is different in a way that it could be mixed with any of the others. You could be a futurist and still hold an idealist view. You could be a historicist or a preterist and still hold an idealist view, because you could say these things really do have a fulfillment in events, but they also, in the sovereignty of God, they illustrate these truths that the idealists think are there, because they are there. So, you could kind of mix things up a bit. My own view, I don't say so in my book. You agree with my whole book and not know my view, but I'll let you in on my little secret, because it's not really that much of a secret. I say it on the air. My view is partially preterist and partially idealist. But, I know good people who are all idealists, some who are all partially preterists. I know some who are all futurists, and some who are historicists too. I have some historicist friends because I have some Seventh-day Adventist friends. But it doesn't really make an awful lot of difference which view is correct if you're following Jesus. If you're not following Jesus, it still won't do you any good to have the correct view. So, having the correct view or the incorrect view won't make a difference if you're following Jesus, and it won't make a difference to you if you're not. If you're not following Jesus, having the right view of Revelation isn't going to help you. If you are following Jesus, having a mistaken view of Revelation probably isn't going to hurt you too much. The church got along for 300 years before it was in the canon of Scripture. The church still survived without any official view on the book of Revelation. But it's fascinating, and I believe, the Bible says in Proverbs, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. And so, having said all that I've said about, it doesn't really matter what view you take, I still think I'd rather know what's true than not. And so I'm going to still search. It's just not going to be the main focus of my search. There's things more important than my understanding of Revelation. I believe that following Jesus, I think understanding the Sermon on the Mount has a lot more to do with the way we live than understanding the book of Revelation. And I think a lot of people who are really immersed in the book of Revelation and speculation stuff, they're really kind of ignoring the Sermon on the Mount in a big way. Some things are practical, and those things we're going to be held accountable for. Things that are theoretical or abstract, there's some benefit in knowing them, I'm sure. But I don't think we're going to be held that much responsible. The Bible says that when we're judged, it says this in Revelation, we're going to be judged according to our works, and not by our opinions about Revelation. So when you get to the pearly gates, if you believe in such pearly gates, and Peter's there, if you believe Peter's going to meet you there, he's not going to say, okay, your name's rank, serial number, and view of Revelation. If you check all the boxes right, you're going to get into heaven, otherwise not. Your view of Revelation has nothing to do with how you're going to get to heaven. And so, you might say, but now I'm confused. Let me give you a little bit of, we're going to close right now because it's 9:30. We're going to close by this. You don't have to be confused. There's an option, an alternative to being confused. You can just be undecided. I'm not confused about anything, but I'm undecided about a lot of things. Confused and undecided are two different things. Undecided means I'm not really sure which one's right, but I'm not sweating it. I'll keep looking into it till I know more. I'm going to keep researching it. When I know more, I'll know more. Being confused means I have to know and I can't figure it out. And it's like a disordered state of mind. It's you're ill at ease and you're freaking out. Confused, not necessary. You can refuse to be confused and just remain undecided until you know. And maybe you already do know. Maybe you're not undecided. But for those who feel confused, I'd say choose undecided instead of confused. It's a much nicer way to live. All right, let's pray. Father, I thank you for these good people who sat so long to listen so much. And I believe probably in most cases they did so because they really care to know what your word teaches and want to understand, as I do, what this book is about and what every book of the Bible is about. We want to know your word and understand it. We want to live by it. And I pray that as we go through the remainder of our lives, as we continue to study your word, that things will become clear that are not yet clear as we sit here. Some things may be really muddled in our minds at the moment, but they can become clear as we continue to wait on you, meditate day and night on your word, pray for your Spirit to give us enlightenment, and live contented with what you're willing to show us now, and patient to wait for what you want to show us in the future. And I pray that your Holy Spirit will superintend our thinking on all these things and lead us into all truth as Jesus promised. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.